The sun was not yet a curse. In Mesquite Flats, dawn was a brief mercy. A smear of pale violet against the eastern ridges of the San Cristobal territory. The air was still, holding the night's meager cool, but the wind already carried the day's promise, the sharp, medicinal tang of creosote and the dry, baked scent of deep sand. Beckett Rowan felt the grit on his teeth before he saw the light. He stood at the lip of his well, the only one drawing sweet water for 20 miles. It was less a well and more a deep, stone-lined wound in the earth, a gamble his father had taken and won. Just before losing everything else to drought and fever, his hands closed around the rope. It was hemp, thick as a man's thumb but bleached white and dangerously frayed. The fibers bit into his calluses, a familiar pain that anchored him to the morning. He leaned back, his boots digging into the hard-pan clay, starting the long haul. The wooden pulley overhead groaned, a sound so familiar it was part of the silence. Beckett was a man carved down by the land. His shoulders were broad, but stooped. His flannel shirt bleached near white by the relentless sun. He was poor, a fact written into the cracked leather of his boots and the permanent squint lines around his gray eyes. This land didn't reward hard work. It merely tolerated survival. The bucket was heavy, catching on the stone lining 50 feet below. He hauled, paused, hauled again, the muscles in his back screaming a dull, familiar complaint. This was his morning prayer, this fight for water. A sound broke the rhythm, not the skitter of a lizard or the rustle of a quail. It was the heavy scrape of a boot on gravel, followed by a muffled collapse and a sharp, bitten-off curse that the wind snatched away. Instinct, honed by 4 years of solitude and loss, took over. Beckett dropped the rope. The bucket crashed against the well wall far below. A hollow boom, and the pulley spun free with a sickening squeal. His right hand snapped to his hip. It found only empty air and worn denim. The cold realization hit him harder than the morning chill. The colt. Gone. Sold 3 months back in Hollow Bend. Sold for 6 bags of winter hay that his last bony cow had eaten just before dying anyway. He was defenseless. His only weapon was a rusty shovel leaning against the cistern, 20 feet away. Too far. He froze, listening. The sound had come from the patch of cholla cactus and brittle bush near the property line, where the land tilted down toward the arroyo. The silence that followed was heavier, more threatening than the noise had been. He could hear his own heart, a frantic drum against his ribs. He tasted dust and fear. They did not rise like men. They rose like ghosts, separating themselves from the gray-brown landscape. One moment, there was only cactus and shadow. The next, there were 5 figures. Apache. Even from this distance, he could see the desperation. They were not a war party. They were the remnants of one. Their buckskins were torn, smeared with dirt and old blood. They walked with the slow, agonizing shuffle of men who had pushed past exhaustion into a living death. They stopped, seeing him. The one in the lead was smaller, moving with a stiff, painful grace. It was a woman. Beckett's breath caught. He had heard the whispers in town, tales told by freighters and frightened prospectors. Asha Tenaya, a leader, ruthless and clever, who moved like smoke. Now, she just looked thirsty. Her black hair was matted with dust. A crude bandage, dark with dried blood, was wrapped tight around her left shoulder and upper arm. Her face was granite, streaked with sweat, but her eyes, even from yards away, were alive. They were dark, assessing, and held a terrifying, calm vigilance. She held a knife, but it hung loose in her hand, not raised to threaten. The 4 warriors with her were in worse shape. They swayed on their feet. Their rifles were slung, muzzles down. They were dying of thirst. Beckett knew the look. He had seen it in cattle, in prospectors, and once, long ago, in the mirror. It was the look of insides turned to fire and dust. The sun broke the ridge. The mercy of dawn vanished, replaced instantly by the tyranny of the high desert day. The heat arrived like a physical blow. The pale violet sky hardened to a blinding, metallic blue. The space between Beckett and the Apache shimmered. They stood 20, maybe 30, paces apart, a lifetime. Between them sat the half-filled water bucket Beckett had drawn just before the noise. He had unhooked it and set it by the cistern, ready to fill the troughs. Its surface reflected the harsh new light. The bucket became the center of the world. Asha Tanaya's gaze flicked from Beckett to the bucket, then back to Beckett. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind, now picking up, whispering through the dry ribs of the Ocotillo fence. This was the test. This was the moment the territory balanced on. He was a white man, alone. They were Apache, armed, desperate. He knew the stories. He knew the hate. He had his own ghosts. Memories of smoke and screaming that still woke him in a cold sweat. The smell of burning pine. The image of May's blue dress, discarded by the door. He looked at the bandage on Asha's shoulder. He looked at the cracked, black lips of the warrior beside her. A young man who looked barely 18. Beckett Rowan made a choice. It wasn't born of bravery or forgiveness. It felt simpler, more primal. It was the law of the well. In this land, water was God, and God did not take sides. Slowly, keeping his hands open and away from his body, he walked to the cistern. He ignored the way the warriors tensed, the way Asha's grip tightened on her knife. He picked up the heavy oak bucket. Water sloshed over the rim, dark and cool against his dusty boots. He took 10 steps toward them. He placed the bucket on the ground, in the dead center of the clearing between his shack and the cholla patch. Then, just as slowly, he retreated. He walked backward, hands still open, until his back hit the rough wood of the well frame. It was a complete, deliberate surrender of defense. He offered his throat to them, and the water. Asha Tanaya watched him, her expression unreadable. She looked at her men. She gave a short, guttural command. The youngest warrior, Nalin, stumbled forward. He fell to his knees beside the bucket. He did not drink. He looked back at his leader. Asha nodded. Nalin plunged his face into the water like an animal. He came up sputtering, water streaming down his chin. He drank again, slower this time, using his hands. Another warrior, Taran, moved to join him, half dragging the third, Koho, who seemed barely conscious. Asha and the old, grizzled warrior, Yiska, remained standing, watching Beckett, always watching. Taran scooped water in his cupped hands, pressing it to Koho's lips. Koho drank weakly. Then his eyes rolled back and he slumped forward. Nalin and Taran caught him, easing him to the ground. They continued to force water into his mouth. Asha finally moved. She walked to the bucket, her limp more pronounced now. She knelt, dipped a gourd she carried on her belt, and drank deeply. She closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, the warrior was gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing relief. She poured water over the back of her neck, then filled the gourd and brought it to Yiska. They drank for a long time. The bucket was nearly empty when they finished. Koho was lying on his back, breathing, but unmoving. Asha Tanaya stood. She walked a few paces closer to Beckett, stopping 10 feet away. The tension returned, but its nature had changed. It was no longer the prelude to violence, but the silence of assessment. She looked at his empty hip. She looked at his shovel, leaning uselessly by the cistern. She looked at his face. Why? Her voice was a rasp, broken by thirst and dust. The English was thick, accented but clear. Beckett leaned his head back against the well frame. The wood was already warm. He thought of May. He thought of the fire. He thought of the hate that had kept him alive for 4 winters. And he looked at the exhausted, wounded people in his yard. Because you needed it, he said. His own voice sounded foreign. Asha held his gaze, searching for the trick, the lie. She seemed about to speak again, perhaps to question the simplicity of his answer. She never got the chance. A new sound intruded, rising from the west. It began as a faint vibration in the soles of Beckett's boots, then grew to a low, rhythmic drumming, hoofbeats, many of them. Coming fast, Yiska hissed a warning. Grabbing his rifle, Nalin and Taran scrambled to their feet. pulling Coho into the meager shade of the cholla. Asha spun, her body instantly transformed back into a weapon. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the low ridge that marked the western approach to his property. Beckett's heart sank. He knew who it was. There was only one man who rode with that much arrogance, that much noise. A plume of alkali dust rose against the morning sun. Then the riders appeared, cresting the ridge. 8 of them. No, 9. They rode hard, fanning out as they approached, their horses kicking up divots of dry earth. They were not soldiers. They were mine guards, company men, wearing the dusters and brass-pinned hats of the Cobalt Ridge mining operation. Leading them, on a big bay gelding, was Silas Cray. Cray was the mine foreman, but he wore a dented silver star pinned to his vest, a star he had appointed himself. He was the law in this part of the territory, which meant he was the law for Cobalt Ridge and nothing else. He raised a hand, and the 9 horsemen pulled up, forming a perfect, intimidating crescent moon around Beckett's well, penning the Apache against the Ocotillo fence. Silas Cray surveyed the scene. Beckett, unarmed by his well, the Apache, staggered and cornered, the empty water bucket sitting between them. A slow, cruel smile spread across Cray's face. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well, Rowan," Silas boomed, his voice grating. "Looks like you're hosting a little party, and you invited the very devils who just burned my South Ridge coal stores to the ground." The dust settled, but the heat remained, now amplified by the tension. Silas Cray's 9 riders formed a loose, threatening semicircle, their horses shifting, their eyes hard. They were mine guards, company men, their loyalty bought by the ounce. Cray sat his bay gelding in the center of the arc, a man who enjoyed the geometry of intimidation. He was thick in the chest and short in the temper. The dented tin star on his vest was a mockery of the law, a tool for the Cobalt Ridge Mining Company. He spat a thick stream of tobacco juice. It sizzled on the hardpan. "I said," Cray repeated, his voice a low growl meant to carry, "You are harboring the arsonists who torched my coal stores at Cobalt Ridge." He pointed a gloved finger at Asha. "That band right there." Beckett Rowan did not move. He felt the eyes of the riders on him, and the sharper, more assessing gaze of the Apache at his back. He was stuck in the middle, a single, unarmed man on his own useless patch of dirt. "This is my land, Silas," Beckett said. His voice was steady, but he tasted copper. "I ain't disputin' your claim. Rowan, I'm statin' a fact. They burned the stores 'fore dawn. Tracks led right here. Now, step aside." Beckett took 2 steps forward instead, widening the distance between himself and the well. He planted his feet. He was now the only thing between 9 loaded rifles and 5 exhausted people. "They came here for water. Silas, they were dying. They should have died faster." Cray sneered. Behind Beckett, Asha Tanaya made a low, almost imperceptible sound. It was not a word, but a command. The warriors with her, Nalin and Taran, who had instinctively raised their rifles, froze. They did not lower their weapons, but they did not aim them. They simply held their position. Asha herself stood apart, near the unconscious Coho. Her wounded shoulder was rigid, her face a mask of dried sweat and dirt. Her eyes locked onto Silas Cray, and they held an unnerving calm. It was not the calm of surrender, nor the fire of defiance. It was the flat, patient gaze of a predator waiting to see if the noise in the brush was a threat or merely a distraction. Silas hated that look. He hated the land. He hated the natives. And he particularly hated stubborn, poor ranchers who thought a deed gave them power. He decided to break him. Cray's voice softened, dropping into a tone of false, shared grief. It was a tool he used often, like a pickaxe, to find a man's cracks. "Beckett, you of all people," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I remember the smoke. I was on the posse that rode out here. 4 years ago, wasn't it?" Beckett's hands clenched at his sides. The dust in the air suddenly smelled of pine smoke and burned fabric. He did not answer. "I remember your wife, May." Silas pushed, his voice oozing sympathy that felt like acid. "Sweet woman, and that baby she was carrying, Never even got to draw breath." A visible tremor went through Beckett. He saw the collapsed roof of his original cabin, the one May had planted morning glories by. "They did that, Beckett," Silas said, his voice hardening, his finger jabbing toward Asha again. "Native hands, native torches. They burned her, they cut her, and here you are, giving her killers your last drop of water. What in God's name would May think of you right now?" It was a precise, cruel strike, aimed at the foundation of the man. Silas expected him to crumble, to step aside in a wash of grief and renewed rage. One of the riders, a young man named Evan Dorr, looked away. Suddenly ashamed to be witnessing it, Beckett Rowan did not crumble. The memory of the fire was sharp, but another, fresher memory was sharper, the desperation in Nayland's eyes as he drank, the absolute stillness of Asha as she waited for his decision. He looked up, not at Silas, but at the riders behind him, one by one, before his gaze settled back on the foreman. "I remember the fire," Beckett said, his voice a low rasp, hollowed out by the past. "I also remember what I found when the smoke cleared." Silas's smirk faltered. This was not the expected response. "Boot prints, Silas, not moccasins. Heavy prints, from new boots, the kind the company store sells." Beckett's eyes narrowed. "And I remember the tracks of shod horses, not ponies, killers," Beckett said, the words dropping like stones into the well. "Wear many skins." A dead, ringing silence fell over the yard. Silas Cray's face went rigid. The false sympathy evaporated, replaced by a flash of cold, reptilian anger. The implication hung in the air, thick and toxic. It was too much for Evan Dorr, the young rider's fear, stoked by Cray's stories and now confused by Beckett's words, boiled over. "He's with them," Evan shouted, his voice cracking. "They're devils. He's a traitor." With a panicked, jerky movement, Evan Dorr ripped his Winchester rifle from its saddle scabbard. The metallic rasp of the lever action cut the silence as he chambered around. He yanked the rifle to his shoulder, the barrel swinging wildly, aiming at Asha. Instantaneously, Asha Tenaya moved. She didn't charge, she didn't duck. She shifted her weight, a fluid, lateral slide that put her wounded body between the rifle and her men. Her hand blurred to her waist, not to the empty rifle slung on her back, but to the long, bone-handled knife sheathed there. She didn't draw it. Her fingers just rested on the hilt, her knuckles white. She was ready. The world stopped. The heat, the wind, the breathing of 9 horses. Everything compressed into the tiny space between Evan Dorr's trigger finger and Asha's hand. "Stand down!" Beckett's voice was not a shout. It was a roar. It was the sound of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. It cracked like a whip, full of a sudden, terrifying authority that shocked everyone, including Beckett himself. Evan Dorr flinched, his finger tightening on the trigger, but he did not fire. His eyes, wide with panic, darted to Beckett. Beckett Rowan did not look at the boy. He stared directly at Silas Cray, the man who held the real leash. "This," Beckett said, his voice dropping to a hard, resonant growl, "is my land." He jabbed a finger toward the ground, to the dark, damp patch where the Apache had knelt. "The water here is for anyone who is dying. That is the only law. I don't care about your coal, and I don't care about your star." He took a step toward Cray's horse, an act of sheer, unarmed madness. "Get off my land." The tension vibrated, a low hum that threatened to tear the morning apart. Silas Cray looked at Beckett's face, a mask of iron and grief. He looked at Asha, poised like a rattlesnake. He looked at his own men. Evan was trembling, near tears. The others were grim, their hands on their guns, but their eyes were uneasy. They were hired guns, not soldiers. They were paid to intimidate prospectors and bust up picket lines, not to murder a white rancher and a band of natives in broad daylight, especially not after that accusation Beckett had thrown. "Killers wear many skins." The words echoed in Cray's mind. A massacre here would be messy. It would bring questions. It might even bring a real marshal from Red Mesa, one who wasn't on the company payroll. Silas Cray was a bully, But he was also a pragmatist. This fight wasn't clean. Not anymore. He gathered his reins, his face a knot of frustrated rage. He shot Evan Dorr a look of pure disgust. "Put it down, boy. You look stupid." Evan lowered the rifle, his face burning crimson. Cray turned his horse, a sharp, violent pivot. He looked down at Beckett, his eyes promising retribution. "You picked your side. Rowan." He spat. "You're harboring fugitives. That's a territorial crime." "It's my water," Beckett said again, his voice flat. "Fine. Let them drink." Silas sneered. "Because I'll be back. And when I come back, it won't be for an argument. It'll be with a warrant from the circuit judge, charging you with aiding and abetting murder." He motioned to his men. "We're done here." The 9 riders wheeled their horses, kicking up a cloud of stinging alkali dust. They rode west, back toward the skeletal headframes of the Cobalt Ridge mine, their departure as sudden as their arrival. Beckett stood in the swirling dust, not moving, until the last faint drum of their hooves faded into the desert. The silence they left behind was louder than the confrontation. He could hear his own heart pounding, a frantic bird in his chest. He finally let out the breath he had been holding. It felt like he hadn't breathed since dawn. He turned slowly. The dust began to clear. Asha Tenaya had not moved. Her hand was still on her knife. She was staring at him, her dark eyes sharp, analytical. The gratitude for the water was gone. The desperation was gone. She was looking at him now as a man who had named her an enemy, then stood between her and 9 rifles. She was looking at him as if he were the most dangerous thing in the yard. The silence that flooded the yard after Cray's departure was thick and heavy, like silt. The dust cloud, which had momentarily obscured the sun, began to settle, coating everything in a fine, gritty layer. The day's heat, no longer held at bay by adrenaline, slammed down on them. Beckett Rowan's ears rang. He felt hollowed out. He had faced down 9 rifles with nothing but words, and he had won. But it was a victory that tasted like ash. Silas Cray would be back, and he would not come with arguments next time. He turned to the Apache. They had not relaxed. Asha Tenaya's hand was still on her knife, and Yiska's rifle was still held at a low, ready angle. They were watching him, their expressions opaque, their bodies coiled. He had saved them, but he had also named them. He was an enemy who had acted like a friend, which made him the most unpredictable thing in the desert. The warrior named Coho, still slumped against the cholla, groaned. The sound was thin, a dry rasp that cut through the tension. Beckett's gaze shifted to the man. He was dying. The water had come too late, or the heat was too strong. "The barn," Beckett said. His voice was hoarse. Asha's eyes snapped to his. He pointed with his chin toward a sagging structure of sun-bleached wood and corrugated tin that leaned precariously to the south. It had been his father's, built with hope 20 years ago, and was now slowly surrendering to gravity and termites. "He'll die in the sun," Beckett said. "There's shade in the barn." Asha held his gaze for a long moment, searching for the trap. She saw none, only a tired, defeated man standing next to a well. She gave a short nod. Nalin and Taryn, their own faces masks of exhaustion, moved to their fallen companion. They looped their arms under his shoulders and, with a synchronized grunt, hauled Coho to his feet. He was dead weight, his moccasins dragging in the dust. They half carried, half dragged him toward the barn. Beckett led the way, pulling open the heavy, warped door. It scraped across the hard-packed earth with a sound like a tomb opening. The air that rushed out was stifling, thick with the smell of dry rot, old manure, and the faint, sweet scent of the hay he had bought with his last gun. Inside, the light was dim, cut into sharp golden bars by the cracks in the walls. It was marginally cooler. Beckett pointed to a corner where a small pile of the expensive, useless hay remained. "Put him there," he said. Nalin and Taryn gently lowered Coho onto the hay. The man's breathing was shallow, his skin a pale, ashen gray beneath the dust and sweat. Beckett went to a small, dusty workbench and returned with a tin canteen. It was his own. He uncorked it and handed it to Taryn. Just sips. Too much too fast will kill him. Taryn nodded, understanding the instruction. If not the language, Yiska, the old warrior, did not enter. He took up a position just outside the barn, his back to the wall, his gaze sweeping the western ridge where Cray had disappeared. He was the watchman. Asha Tanaya did not enter fully either. She stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the blinding light of the yard. Her good hand rested on the doorframe, her wounded arm held stiffly at her side. She was a guardian, her eyes tracking Beckett's every move, her ears counting every potential threat from the outside. Beckett sat down on an overturned bucket, 10 feet from her. The silence stretched again, filled only by Coho's painful breathing and the buzz of a trapped fly. He was right, Beckett said, his voice quiet. Asha's gaze sharpened. She did not ask for clarification. About my wife, May. He rubbed his face, his palms scraping against the stubble on his cheeks. It was 4 years ago. This, he motioned to the small, one-room shack he now lived in. This isn't the real house. The real house was over there. He pointed to a patch of ground marked by a few charred timbers and a stone chimney that rose from the weeds like a forgotten headstone. May liked to plant things. She thought you could make anything grow here, if you just gave it enough water and stubbornness. She was carrying our first, a boy, we thought. He paused, his throat tightening. He did not look at Asha. He looked at the floor, at the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. They came just after dusk. I was checking the north fence line. I saw the smoke. By the time I got back, it was over. He closed his eyes. Cray was on the posse. They said it was Apache, a war party. The tracks were confused, but they found an arrowhead. Enough for them, enough for me. He fell silent for a long time. Asha remained perfectly still in the doorway, watching him. I believed it. Beckett continued, his voice barely a whisper. I hated, God, how I hated. I hated every man, woman, and child of your people. The hate kept me warm for 3 winters. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting her dark ones. But the story never sat right. They rode like white men, heavy in the saddle. They used too much kerosene. It wasn't a raid. It was an extermination. Then, 6 months later, I was in Hollow Bend, in the saloon. I was drunk. A lot of men were drunk. Railroad men, celebrating a new survey contract. One of them, a subcontractor for the Great Meridian Railroad, was buying rounds. He was bragging about how they were clearing the territory, how the settlers were too scared of the Indians to fight the company for land rights. And then he said it. He said he and his boys had dressed up for a party at a stubborn rancher's place to get the ball rolling. He said the bitch shouldn't have been there. The stable was so quiet, Beckett could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. I hit him. I nearly killed him with a chair. I was thrown out. By the time I sobered up, he was gone. But I knew what those boot prints meant. The ones Silas Cray's posse didn't see. The ones with the hobnails from the company store. He finally looked directly at Asha. When I accused you today, I was talking to Silas, the killers who burned my wife. They were wearing your skin. Asha Tanaya's expression did not change, but something in her eyes, a flicker of guarded empathy, shifted. She turned her head, looking out at the sun-blasted yard. My husband was Alakai, she said, her voice just as low, just as raw. My brother was Taza. They were hunting 2 moons ago by the Painted Arroyo Spring. She turned back to him. They were not killed by soldiers. They were shot from the rocks, from behind, by men with buffalo rifles. Bounty hunters. They call themselves. They wear rented stars. Like his. She nodded toward the ridge where Silas had vanished. I found them 3 days later. The men who did it were clumsy. They left tracks. Heavy boots. The kind that slip on rock. She paused, and her eyes narrowed. A new, shared understanding dawning. And the powder. The smell was wrong. It was rich, new, the kind soldiers use, not the reloaded trade powder. The 2 stories hung in the dead, hot air of the barn. They were not 2 stories. They were one, a man's wife, murdered by fake Apache, a woman's husband, murdered by fake lawmen. It's not a war, Beckett said, the realization settling in his stomach like a cold stone. It's a business, a land-clearing business. They push my people onto the reservations, Asha said, her voice gaining a cold fire. They push your people off your deeds, and in the middle, the land is empty. For the mine, for the railroad. And Silas Cray is the man who holds the match. Beckett finished. From the shadow outside the door, the old warrior, Yiska, spoke. He said something in his own language, his voice like gravel. Asha listened, then looked at Beckett, a strange new light in her eyes. Yiska, he has seen the tracks. He followed the men who burned the coal store at Cobalt Ridge. He thought to ambush them. And Beckett leaned forward. The tracks were heavy. Shod horses, hobnail boots. He followed them north, not south, toward the reservation. He followed them to a box canyon near the mine. He watched them ride in. He said they were not Apache. They were white men, washing paint from their faces. The accusation Beckett had thrown at Silas, born of a drunkard's boast, was now a proven fact. Silas hadn't just accused Asha of the fire. He had known she was innocent, because his own men had said it. He had come here to silence the only witness, or to pin his crime on her. A silent, terrible understanding passed between Beckett and Asha. The world had just reformed itself. The lines were no longer red and white. The lines were the rich and the poor, the company and the settler, the hunter and the hunted. A new unspoken promise formed in the dusty air if Silas Cray returned. They would not be fighting for their own survival. They would be fighting for the truth. But truth, in this land, was a fragile thing. Asha pushed herself off the doorframe. She walked out into the blinding sun. Beckett, confused, rose and followed her. She walked to the well. She scanned the ground by its base, then bent stiffly, her wounded arm held close, and picked up a flat, hand-sized piece of limestone. It was smooth, baked white by the sun. She placed it on the lip of the well, next to the frayed rope. "In my grandfather's time," Asha said, looking at the stone, "when a lie was so great it poisoned the water, our people had a ritual, the water split stone." She looked at Beckett. "The water hears everything. The stone remembers. You place your hand on the stone. You speak your truth. If you lie, the stone cracks, and the water in the well dries up forever. It is a great risk." She did not hesitate. She placed her right hand, palm down, on the warm stone. "I am Asha Tanaya," she said, her voice clear and formal, carrying in the still air. "My husband Alakai and my brother Taza were murdered by men who served the mine. We did not burn the coal stores. We were running from those same men when we found your well. This is my truth." She lifted her hand and locked her eyes on Beckett. "Your turn." Beckett looked at the stone. He looked at the dark. Still water in the well. He thought of May. He thought of the 4 years of poison, of blind hate, that had rotted him from the inside out. He had told Asha his story, but now he had to swear it to the land itself. Slowly, he reached out and placed his own calloused fingers on the stone. It was hot, solid, and real. "My name is Beckett Rowan. My wife, May, and our unborn child were murdered 4 years ago." His voice was thick. They were killed by men dressed as Apache, but they were not. They were white men, paid by the railroad, to start a fire. The same men Silas Cray now works for. He looked directly at Asha, his gaze unwavering. "Today, when I gave you water, I gave it to the people who I thought had killed my family. I do not know why, but I know this: the men who killed my wife are the same men who hunt you. My enemy is your enemy." He pulled his hand away. The stone sat unchanged. The water in the well remained dark and still. Beckett let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. A weight, a crushing, 4-year-old weight, did not disappear, but it shifted. The corrosive, solitary poison of his grief, the hate that had defined him, was suddenly gone. In its place was a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. It was the first time his heart had felt light since the day May's grave was filled. He had lost his wife, but he had just found his enemy, and she was standing right in front of him. The sun collapsed. It did not set. It bled out over the western ridge, dragging streaks of violent orange and bruised purple across the sky, before surrendering the world to a profound, cooling darkness. The heat, however, retained its memory. It radiated up from the hard-pan clay, a phantom warmth that would linger for hours. Then the wind came. It was the true breath of the high desert night, moving across the vast, open alkali flats, carrying a faint, mineral-sharp scent, almost like salt, inside the barn. The air was still thick with the day's trapped heat and the smell of hay. Coho's breathing had steadied. The water and the shade had pulled him back from the brink. He was asleep, a deep, exhausted sleep. Naylan and Taryn sat near the entrance, rifles across their knees, their silhouettes stark against the deep indigo of the sky. Old Man Yiska had vanished, melting into the landscape to scout the perimeter, a ghost checking on the movements of other ghosts. Beckett stood by the well, coiling the frayed rope. His hands ached. His mind was a quiet, humming void. The confrontation with Silas Cray, the ritual of the water-split stone. It had all drained him, leaving him empty. He saw Asha step out of the barn. She moved into the faint light of the rising moon, her face turned toward the west, toward the mine, toward the threat. She stood for a long time, listening. The wind played with the loose strands of her hair. She moved stiffly, her body rigid with pain. He saw her lift her right hand, trying to work at the crude bandage on her left shoulder. It was soaked through again, the dark stain spreading. She tried to unwrap it one-handed. Her teeth gritted. Beckett stopped coiling the rope. He walked past her, not speaking, to his own small shack. The one-room cabin was dark. He struck a match, the sulfur flaring, and lit the hurricane lantern on his table. He picked it up, and from a low shelf, took a glass bottle half full of amber liquid whiskey, strong enough to clean a wound or dull a mind. He found a small roll of clean cotton, saved from a feed sack lining, and a strip of linen May had torn for bandages years ago, still neatly folded in a wooden box. He returned to the barn. Asha was sitting on the ground, her back against the rough exterior wall, her eyes closed. She opened them as he approached, her hand instinctively moving to her knife. She relaxed, but only slightly. When she saw the lantern and the supplies, he set the lantern on the ground between them. The yellow light threw their shadows long and flickering against the barn wall. It created a small, intimate circle of gold in the vast, dark world. "That needs cleaning," he said. It wasn't a question. She just nodded, her jaw tight. He knelt in front of her. The proximity was sudden, unsettling. He could smell the dust in her hair and the faint, smoky scent of her buckskin. He uncorked the whiskey bottle. The sharp smell of alcohol cut through the night air. He soaked a wad of the cotton. "This will sting." "I know," she whispered. He gently unwrapped the old, blood-caked bandage. The wound beneath was angry, a deep graze where a bullet had torn through muscle. It was clean, no infection. Not yet, but it was raw. He hesitated for only a second, then pressed the whiskey-soaked cotton to the wound. Asha's entire body went rigid. A sharp, ragged hiss of breath escaped through her clenched teeth. She bit down hard on her lower lip, her eyes squeezing shut. A fine tremor ran through her entire frame. She did not make a sound, but her good hand clenched into a fist in the dust. "Easy," Beckett said, his voice low. "Easy, just breathe." He held the cotton there, his own muscles tensing in sympathy. He was intensely aware of the sounds that filled the small circle of light, her sharp, unsteady breathing, the thud of his own heart against his ribs, the distant, lonely creak of the well pulley as it shifted in the wind. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound with a practiced, rough gentleness. His hands were calloused and scarred from rope and wood, and he feared he was hurting her more. but she held perfectly still, her face a mask of iron control. He finished, and the worst of it was over. He picked up the clean linen strip. "It's clean," he said, his voice almost an apology. "No festering." He began to wrap the bandage, his large, clumsy fingers moving with surprising care. He had to loop it under her arm and across her collarbone. He was close, his face just inches from hers. He kept his eyes on his work, on the path of the white linen against her dark, sun-scorched skin. He tried not to look at her face, but the lantern light was magnetic. It hollowed the shadows under her high cheekbones and caught the moisture on her eyelashes. He found his gaze drawn to the line of her jaw, the grim set of her mouth. He looked away, back to the bandage, but his eyes kept returning. He finished the knot, pulling it snug but not tight. As he went to pull his hands away, her good hand came up. It closed around his wrist, stopping him. He froze. Her hand was strong, her grip firm, but he could feel a fine, exhausted trembling in her fingers. He looked from her hand to her face. Her eyes were open, and she was watching him. The pain was receding, replaced by that same intense, analytical gaze from before. "You gave water," she whispered, her voice still rough. "To an enemy." Beck OK, the request continues, but the thought process truncates here as the user's input is cut off. I will assume the user meant Beckett and continue the thought process based on the provided outline. Continuation of thought process based on the full Part 4 outline provided in the previous turn. Beckett didn't know what to say. He looked down at her hand on his wrist. It was just water. "No." Her grip tightened, her fingers digging slightly into his skin. "It was everything. You spoke the truth at the stone. You hated my people." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "Today, in here," she tapped her own chest with 2 fingers, "there is no more enemy." She let go of his wrist. The release left his skin feeling strangely cold. He sat back on his heels, then shifted, moving to sit beside her, his back against the same rough-hewn wall. The wood was still faintly warm from the day. They sat in silence, their shoulders a few inches apart, watching the lantern flame gutter in the breeze. Yiska returned, a silent shadow, and took his place by the barn door, exchanging a few low words with Nayland before melting back into the night. "May used to say the sky was bigger here," Beckett said, his voice quiet, aimed at the darkness. "She said back east, the trees and hills chopped it up. But out here, she said you could see the bones of the universe." Asha was quiet for a long time. He thought she might not have heard him. Then she spoke, her voice softer now. "My grandfather taught me the stars are not lights. He said they are holes. The world is wrapped in a great, dark blanket, and the light of the Creator is too bright for us to see. So he pokes small holes in the blanket, to let bits of the light through so we do not forget what waits behind it." They sat with that, 2 different maps of the same sky. The wind shifted, and Beckett breathed in deeply. "It smells like rain." Asha finished. "Far off, on the mountains, the smell always travels before the water. The first rain of the season." Beckett murmured, a memory stirring. May always loved that smell. "My people call it the promise," Asha said. "The land remembers." They fell silent again, but the silence was different now. It was not empty. It was shared. He could feel the warmth of her body through his shirt, though they were not quite touching. He was aware of her breathing, now slow and deep. He was aware of his own heart, a slow, steady drum. The hate that had been his only companion for 4 years was gone, and the quiet that replaced it was vast, empty, and terrifying. He turned his head to look at her. She turned her head to look at him at the same instant. Their eyes met in the flickering, golden light. He saw the pain in her gaze, but he also saw the iron of her will, the strength that had led her men this far. She saw his exhaustion, the profound, hollowed-out grief that defined him. She leaned in. It was a small movement, hesitant but deliberate. Her good hand came up, not to his wrist, but to his chest. Her fingers rested on his collarbone, her palm flat against his shirt. He could feel the warmth of her hand, the calloused tips of her fingers. It was an anchor, a question. Beckett did not pull away. He did not move at all. He just watched her. She closed the last few inches. The kiss was not what he expected. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of a storybook. It was slow. It was gentle, yet impossibly bold. It was the taste of dust, and the faint, sharp tang of the whiskey he had used on her wound. It was a long, breathless moment of warmth and surprise. He felt her hand tighten on his collarbone, and his own arm, moving with a mind of its own, slid around her back. He was careful of her wounded side. His hand came to rest on her waist, his fingers spreading wide, pulling her just slightly closer. It was a movement of support, of acceptance. He felt her sigh against his lips, a small release of breath. They stayed like that for a long, quiet moment. It was a kiss of survivors, a desperate, silent acknowledgement that they were both, against all odds, still alive. They broke apart, but not far. They rested their foreheads together. Beckett's eyes were closed. He was breathless. He could feel her breath, warm and quick, on his face. A small, rusty sound escaped his chest. It might have been a laugh. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice a rough murmur against his skin. "Silas, the warrant. It will be hard." "I know," he breathed. "But tonight," her eyes opened, finding his in the dark. "Tonight is enough?" They sat for another minute, letting the quiet settle back around them, the adrenaline of the day, the shock of the confrontation. And now this sudden, unexpected intimacy left them both profoundly, deeply weary. Asha pulled back, her hand dropping from his chest. The loss of contact felt immediate. "You need sleep," Beckett said. She nodded, her body slumping against the wall. "Coho is safe. My men will watch." Beckett stood, his knees cracking. He went into his shack and returned with his only good blanket, a heavy, dark blue wool trade blanket. He offered it to her. She looked at the blanket, then at his shack, then at her men sleeping or watching in the barn. She would not leave them. He understood. He walked into the barn, to a pile of clean, dry hay in the corner, far from Coho, but within the protective circle. He spread the blanket over the hay. "Rest here," he said. She looked at the small bed he had made, then at him. She nodded once, a gesture of gratitude. She walked past him and lay down on her good side, her back to the wall, pulling the blanket up. She was asleep almost before her head hit the hay, her hand still resting on the hilt of her knife. Beckett stood in the barn doorway for a long time, watching the stars. He could not go to his cot. He was part of this now. He was the anchor. He sat down against the doorframe, his back to the wood, his gaze on the dark horizon. He would take the first watch. The desert night grew cold. He pulled his arms around his knees, listening to the 5 strangers breathing in his barn. His head nodded. He was so tired. He drifted, his mind sliding into the gray space between wakefulness and sleep. He was startled by a touch. He looked down. Asha had moved in her sleep, or perhaps she had not been asleep at all. She had shifted closer, her hand reaching out from under the blanket, finding his, her fingers closed around his hand. He looked at her. Her eyes were closed, her face calm in the moonlight, but her grip was firm, an unconscious, grounding touch. "Beck, okay. The user's input cuts off again at Beck. I will complete the thought and the scene as intended by the outline." Beckett did not pull away. He turned his hand, linking his fingers with hers. Her skin was warm, calloused, like his. He sat there, leaning against the rough wood. Her hand held fast in his. No boundaries were crossed. No words were spoken. It was just the simple, profound comfort of human contact in a world designed to kill them. He did not sleep. He sat awake, listening. He heard the breathing of the sleepers, the soft shuffle of Nalin shifting his weight, the long, mournful cry of a coyote on the ridge, and underneath it all, the faint, rhythmic, hopeful creak of the well pulley, singing its quiet song to the darkness, his heart. a stone for 4 years, felt a single, painful, terrifying beat. It was remembering how to live. The night's fragile truce was shattered by the light. Dawn in Mesquite Flats was not a gentle arrival. It was an invasion, a blade of pale gray light that sliced open the darkness and exposed the cold, hard ground. Beckett woke with a start. His neck ached from sleeping upright against the doorframe. His first, immediate sensation was cold his hand. He looked down. His fingers were still loosely entwined with Asha's, but the shared warmth was gone, leached away by the pre-dawn chill. He carefully extracted his hand. Her eyes snapped open. There was no drowsy transition. One moment she was still. The next she was awake, alert, and her hand was on her knife. She saw him, and the tension eased. But the intimacy of the night was gone, replaced by the tactical reality of the day. Yiska was already on his feet, standing 20 yards out by the Ocotillo fence, a motionless silhouette against the rapidly lightening sky. He was looking north. "Someone comes," Yiska said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the morning stillness. Beckett was on his feet in an instant, his heart hammering. He squinted, following Yiska's gaze. A figure was moving through the cholla and brittle bush, not on the road, but cutting across the rough land. They were not riding, they were running, stumbling with a desperate, lurching gait. Asha moved to Beckett's side, her face grim. One person, on foot. Nayland and Taryn emerged from the barn, rifles at the ready, flanking Asha. The figure burst into the clearing. It was not a man. It was a woman. Her hair a wild tangle, her calico dress torn at the shoulder. She saw the well, and then she saw the people standing near it. She stopped, her chest heaving, a sound of pure terror catching in her throat. "Beckett!" she screamed. Beckett recognized her. Ruth called her. He took a step toward her. Her family had a small, failing homestead 5 miles north, near the mouth of Painted Arroyo. Ruth looked at him, her eyes wild. Then her gaze locked onto Asha, Nalin, and Taryn. A high, thin shriek tore from her lips. "No! Oh, God! No!" she screamed, scrambling backward, falling over her own feet. "It was them, Beckett! It was them! They killed Pa! They killed everyone!" She pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at Asha Tanaya. "It was them?" Beckett froze. He looked at Asha. Her face was stone, but her eyes, her sharp, intelligent eyes, locked on his. She gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was not a denial. It was a warning. "Ruth," Beckett said, advancing slowly, his hands open. "Calm down. Tell me what happened. Painted Arroyo." She sobbed, collapsing in the dust near the well, just feet from the water-split stone. Just before the light, they came, so many of them, shouting, "The paint! The red paint! They set the cabins on fire. They shot my PA when he came out. They shot everyone. She is lying." Taryn growled in his own language. "No," Asha said, her voice a low, cold command. "She is not lying. She is mistaken. This is the warrant." Beckett understood instantly. "Silas," he knelt beside the weeping woman. "Ruth, the men you saw. Did you see their faces?" "It was dark," she cried. "They had paint. They whooped, like in the stories. They were Apache, I saw them." Yiska had not moved. The old warrior ignored the hysterical woman. His gaze had shifted. While everyone was focused on Ruth, he had been reading the ground. He began to move, not toward Ruth, but circling wide, to the north, picking up the trail of her arrival. He bent low, his body parallel to the ground, moving with a silent, fluid grace. He was not tracking her. He was tracking what she had run from. "He checks the story," Asha said quietly to Beckett. Yiska vanished into the arroyo for a full minute, then re-emerged, walking slowly, his eyes still down. He stopped, knelt, and examined something on the ground. He returned to the group, his face impassive. He walked directly to Asha, ignoring everyone else, and spoke in a low, rapid torrent of Apache. Then he opened his hand. In his palm was a fresh, crescent-shaped divot of hardpan clay, marked by two small, metallic circles. Beside it was a dark, greasy clump of dirt. Asha's eyes narrowed to slits of black ice. She looked up at Beckett. "He cut their trail, back 2 miles, where they attacked the arroyo," she translated, her voice clipped and precise. "Not moccasins, boots, the same heavy hobnail boots from the mine, shod horses, many of them." She pointed to the greasy clump. "And this, he found it on the wheel tracks of a wagon they brought." Her lip curled in disgust. "Tar, the kind they used to seal the railroad ties. They left a trail a blind man could follow. They want to be found. They want the tracks to be followed. Here." The plan was laid bare, brutal in its simplicity. Cray's men, disguised as Apache, had massacred the Calder homestead. They had deliberately left a trail pointing south, directly toward Beckett's well. "He's fast," Beckett said, his stomach clenching. "He burns the arroyo at dawn. He'll ride into Hollow Bend in an hour. Say his fears were true. He'll raise a posse to hunt the savage killers, and the tracks will lead them right to my door." "Or they will find you," Asha said, "harboring us, the murderers. They will hang you, and they will shoot us." "And the land," Beckett finished, "is cleared. Painted arroyo is empty. Your people are blamed. I am silenced. He wins. He thinks we will run," Asha said. She looked at the rising sun. "We will not run. He wants a war. We will give him a council. He wants to show the settlers an Apache threat. We will show them the truth, in the light." "How?" Beckett asked. "They'll be here in hours, with ropes." Asha pointed to the low, rocky mound that marked the southern edge of Beckett's property. "We build a fire. Taryn." The young warrior nodded. "Not a war signal," Asha continued. "A parley. We send the signal of the water-split stone. 3 long plumes, 2 short, 1 long." She drew the pattern in the dusty air with her finger. "It is the call to council. It tells the other chiefs Tocho Kintaro that a truth is being spoken at this well. They will come." Beckett felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Asha, a peace signal. Silas's men. They're trying to start a war. They wouldn't know a signal for peace." "No, they would not. Unless," Beckett said, the final, ugly piece clicking into place. "Someone taught it to them. Unless this whole thing is a trap. What if Silas knows that signal? What if he's waiting for you to send it, to call your chiefs, and he's waiting to ambush them all at once?" "It does not matter," Asha said, her resolve unshakable. "It is the only signal we have. We send the truth. If it is a trap, we spring it in the open." She turned, her gaze falling on Yiska and Nalin. "The box canyon," she said, "where you saw the men wash." Yiska nodded. "Nalin, you go with him. You are fast. Yiska will show you the way. Find the canyon. Find the paint. Find the clothes. Find the tar. Find the proof that the mine did this. Do not be seen. Bring it back, now." Nalin's young face was grim. He picked up his rifle and a water skin. He and Yiska exchanged a single look, and then they were gone, slipping into the arroyo and vanishing as if they had never been. Now they were only 4. Beckett, Asha, Taryn, and the still weak Coho. A skeleton crew for a world-ending fight. "Taryn," Asha commanded. "The fire, now!" Taryn sprinted to the mound with his fire-starting kit. Beckett turned to Ruth Calder, who was still rocking back and forth, her sobs quieter now, replaced by a stunned, hollow grief. "Ruth," Beckett said, his voice gentle but firm, "we need you, Hollow Bend." She looked up, her face a mask of tears and dirt. "Town Silas. Silas is there. He'll say I'm lying. He'll say I'm crazy." "Ruth, your father, did he like the mining company?" Beckett asked. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking with a new anger. "He hated them. They filed a claim on his spring, diverted the water. Pa said they were thieves. Just thieves with lawyers." "Then they wanted his land," Beckett said flatly. "And now they have it. Asha is right. Ruth, You are the proof. You have to go to town, but you don't go to Silas. You don't go to the marshal. You go to the other homesteaders, the ones who are just like your PA. He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to focus. You go to the Cartwrights. You go to the Millers. You go to every family that has had their water stolen or their claims jumped. You tell them your PA was murdered. You tell them the mine did it, and they're blaming the Apache. You tell them to come here, to my well. Tell them the men who killed your PA will be here, and tell them the real Apache are here, waiting to talk. The terror in Ruth's eyes began to burn, replaced by a cold, hard fury. She had seen her father shot down. The mine, she whispered. They took his water, and now? She pushed herself to her feet, her thin body trembling, but her gaze set. Yeah, I'll go. I will tell them. I'll tell everyone. Go now. Stay off the main road. Follow the creek bed. Beckett urged. Ruth nodded once, then turned and ran. Not with panic this time, but with a desperate, loping purpose. Toward the south. Toward the town of Hollow Bend. A thin column of white smoke began to rise from the mound. Taryn had the fire going. It was just Beckett and Asha, standing by the well in the growing heat. The morning was barely an hour old, and the world had already ended twice. They will come, Asha said, watching the smoke. Tocho is hot-headed. He will come from the north, expecting a fight. Silas will come from the west, bringing his posse. And Ruth, Beckett added, will bring the farmers from the south. My God, Asha, this isn't a council. It's a powder keg. All of them, in one place, all pointing at each other. Good, she said. The truth burns best when everyone is watching. Beckett looked around his desolate yard. He needed a plan. He needed rules. He grabbed a piece of charcoal from his cold fire pit and a wide, flat piece of planking. He began to sketch. This is the stage, he muttered. He drew a circle. The well. This is the center. This is the neutral ground. The water split stone is the witness box. He drew a line in the dust. This fence post. This is as far as Silas and his men come. Not one step closer to the well. He drew another line near the arroyo. The settlers. They stay by the road. They are the audience. He pointed to the mound where Taryn was now carefully placing damp leaves on the fire. 3 long plumes of smoke began to rise, followed by 2 short, sharp puffs. Then one final, long column. The signal was in the sky. Tocho's men will take the high ground, Asha said, pointing to the ridge. It has to be a hearing, not a battle. Beckett insisted. We need to divide them. When they get here, I talk to the settlers. I'll talk about their land, their water, their stolen claims. I'll show them this isn't a war. It's a real estate transaction. And I will talk to Tocho, Asha said. I will convince him to hold his arrows. I will use the stone. He must listen to the water truth. It won't be enough, Beckett said, pacing. Silas won't let us talk. He'll provoke. He'll have someone, like that boy, Evan, get jumpy. Someone will fire a shot, and it all goes to hell. Asha looked at him, her eyes sharp. Then we make the first shot the last one. Beckett stopped pacing. What do you mean? A new rule, she said, the strategy forming as she spoke. A rule for this place, for the water split stone. We announce it. Before anyone speaks, anyone fires. The parley is over, and the man who fired stands alone. Beckett caught her meaning. We isolate them. We make a pact. If one of Silas's men fires, then Tocho's men lower their weapons. Asha finished. And if one of Tocho's men fires, I will tell the settlers he is the liar. A public disarmament, Beckett said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. We use the crowd against the gunman. We make the man who wants violence the coward in the room. Yes, Asha said. We let the crowd see who broke the water truce. She walked to the well and placed her hand on the flat limestone. It is a good plan. Now, we wait. The waiting was the hardest part. The sun climbed, pressing down with a physical, suffocating weight. The signal fire, tended by Taryn on the low mound. sent its precise, measured column of smoke straight up into the windless, metallic blue sky. 3 long, 2 short, 1 long. The call to council. Beckett stood by the well. Asha stood 10 feet away, watching the northern ridge. They were a handful of survivors in the center of a vast, empty stage, waiting for the actors to arrive. In the barn, Coho was conscious, sitting up against a hay bale, watching the proceedings with the detached curiosity of a man who had already been too close to death to fear it. The silence was the first to break. From the north, they came, not with the thunder of hooves, but as a silent, spreading stain. One moment, the ridge was empty, shimmering in the heat. The next, 30 warriors stood on the skyline, their ponies moving restlessly behind them. They did not ride down. They held the high ground, an audience of bronze statues armed with rifles and lances. In their center sat a man, broad and powerful, his face a mask of anger. He wore a single eagle feather in his hair. Asha's body tensed. "Tocho," she said, her voice low. "He is quick to anger. He sees the smoke from the arroyo. He sees my signal. He is confused, and a confused chief is a dangerous one." Tocho's gaze swept the yard, taking in Asha, Beckett, the barn, the well. He was waiting. He did not have to wait long. From the west, the second wave arrived. This was not a silent appearance. This was a declaration of war. A massive cloud of alkali dust, twice the size of the one from the day before, billowed toward them, carrying the sound of a small army. Silas Cray rode at their head. He had not come with a warrant. He had come with a posse. 20 men, at least. And they were not just mine guards. Beckett's eyes narrowed. The boy, Evan Dorr, was there, his face pale and set, looking haunted. But flanking Silas were 2 new men Beckett had only seen in the saloons of Hollow Bend, men who never bought their own drinks and never spoke above a whisper. One was a thin man with a dead, tobacco-stained mouth, named Brandis. The other, Kepler, was a thick, bearded man who wore 2 Colts, their holsters tied down low against his thighs. They were not company men. They were hired guns. They were here not to arrest, but to finish a job. Silas rode his posse right up to the line Beckett had drawn in the dust, the one marked by the old fence post. He stopped, his men fanning out. A perfect, gleaming, deadly crescent of rifles and hate. "So," Silas boomed, his voice full of mock surprise, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "The party's even bigger today. You invite all your friends. Rowan." He gestured with his chin to the silent Apaches on the ridge. Before Beckett could answer, a new sound came from the south. A different sound. The crunch of boots, the murmur of worried voices, the scrape of iron on stone. A small, bedraggled procession crested the low rise near the road. It was Ruth Calder, her face streaked with tears and dust, but her eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. Behind her walked 5 or 6 other families. The Millers, the Cartwrights, Old Man Hemlock. They were carrying what they had grabbed: pitchforks, shovels, a woodsman's axe. They had no guns. They looked exhausted, frightened, and angry. They were the people the mining company had been squeezing for years. They stopped, a loose, uncertain cluster, near the southern edge of the yard, forming the third point of the triangle. The stage was set. 3 factions, all staring at the 2 people by the well. From his vantage point on the ridge, War Chief Tocho's voice exploded across the yard. It was a roar of betrayal. "Ashatanaya," he shouted, his voice echoing off the barn wall. "Why do you stand with the white man who burns our allies? You call for counsel, but you stand in his shadow. Have you forgotten Alakai? Have you forgotten your own blood, that you side with these butchers?" Silas Cray smirked. Enjoying the show, this was better than he could have planned. Asha did not shout back. She did not look at Tocho. She ignored Silas. In the dead, ringing silence that followed Tocho's accusation, she walked with a steady, measured pace to the well. She placed her right hand, palm down, on the flat, white, water-split stone. "I have forgotten nothing. Tocho," she called out, her voice clear and carrying, a blade in the thick air. The stone is here. The water is listening. I am here to speak the truth. The man who burned the arroyo is here, but it is not this one." Her head turned, slowly, and her eyes, like black flint, locked onto Silas Cray. Tocho was silent. He knew the ritual. He could not attack a parley at the stone. Silas's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of annoyance. He spurred his horse forward one step, his men tensing. "We ain't here for your savage games, you witch. We're here for the murderers of the Calder family, and we're here for the traitor harboring them." He pointed a gloved finger at Beckett. "Rowan, you've got 10 seconds to step away from her and hand over your friends. Do it, and the judge might just listen when I tell him you were a hostage." This was the moment. Beckett looked at the angry faces of the settlers. He looked at the professional, cold eyes of Brandis and Kepler. He looked at the confused, ready to bolt or fire faces of the rest of Cray's posse. He stepped away from Asha, but not toward Silas. He stepped toward the settlers. "He's right," Beckett shouted, his voice cracking with the same authority he had found the day before. The settlers flinched. "We are here to talk about murder, and we're here to talk about theft. Silas Cray says he's here for the Calders, a family he's been trying to run off that land for 2 years. "Lies," Silas roared. "Is it a lie?" "Ruth," Beckett called, his voice cutting through. "Tell them who wanted your father's land." He did. Ruth's voice was a thin, sharp shriek of grief and rage. "The mine, they stole our water, and when Pa wouldn't leave, they—" She broke down, sobbing. "It's not just her," Beckett shouted, turning back to the posse, his finger jabbing at the settlers. "Ask Jed Miller," who filed a new survey claim on his spring, a claim signed by a company lawyer. Ask the Cartwrights, who told them this land would be declared hostile territory if they didn't sell for 10 cents on the dollar. He let the questions hang in the air, then turned, his full attention, the full weight of his anger, landing squarely on the foreman. "There is only one man here who benefits when we fight each other. There is only one man who gets rich when our land is cheap and our families are scared. He doesn't want justice. He wants land. He wants it all." The settlers murmured, their anger finding a new, more solid target. They looked less at the Apache on the ridge and more at the man with the tin star. In the back of Silas's posse, Evan Dorr licked his lips, his eyes darting between Ruth, Beckett, and his boss. This wasn't the righteous posse he had been promised. This felt dirty. "Sir," Evan stammered, his voice cracking. "That girl, she's saying—" Brandis, the thin killer, didn't even look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Tocho's men. He nudged Evan's horse with his own, a hard, sharp bump. "Shut your mouth, kid," Brandis hissed, his voice a dry rattle. "Just watch the ridge. You get paid to shoot, not to think, 'Shut up and live.'" Evan went pale and silent, his hand gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. The crack in the posse's morale was visible to everyone. At that exact moment, miles away, Nalin and Yeska were moving through the shadows of the box canyon. Yeska had led them with unerring speed. They found the abandoned railroad line shack, its door hanging off one hinge. The smell of tar and stale whiskey hit them from 10 yards away. Inside, the evidence was piled in a corner, hasty and arrogant. They had not even bothered to hide it. There were 5 worn buckskin shirts, not Apache make, but cheap trade store copies. Beside them, 3 clay pots, still wet with the same dark red paint Ruth had described. And in the corner, a stack of oil-soaked pine, the same wood used for railway ties, the perfect kindling for a quick, hot fire. Nalen's eyes scanned the room. He saw a wooden crate, its lid pried open. Stenciled on the side, in clean black letters, were 3 words, "Great Meridian Railroad Company." They had it. They had the proof. Yiska grabbed the shirts, Nalen the paint pots. They scrambled out of the shack and began the long, desperate run back to the well. Back in the yard, Silas Cray knew he was losing. The settlers were against him. His own men were wavering, and the Apache had not taken the bait. He had to force the violence. His gaze flicked, almost imperceptibly, To Brandis, it was a signal. Brandis's hand, which had been resting on his thigh, slowly, casually, drifted down, his fingers spreading, hovering just over the worn wooden grip of his Colt. On the ridge, a dozen arrows were nocked. Tocho's warriors saw the movement. Kepler, the other gunman, saw his partner's move and subtly shifted his weight, his own duster falling open, revealing the butt of his second pistol. He cocked his head, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. The air in the yard became so thick it was hard to breathe. The wind stopped. The only sound was Ruth Calder's quiet sobbing. One breath, one move, one shout. The entire territory was balanced on the head of a pin, a single heartbeat away from a massacre. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to shatter. Brandis's fingers splayed, hovering over his Colt. On the ridge, an arrow was drawn to its full length. The air was a held breath. A shout broke the tension. Not from the posse, not from the ridge, from the arroyo. Yiska Asha. It was Nalin. He stumbled out of the dry creek bed, his chest heaving, his face streaked with sweat. He was running so hard he nearly fell. Yiska was right behind him, moving with his same unhurried, ground-eating pace. Nalin did not stop. He ran past the settlers, past the posse, past Beckett, and did not stop until he was standing in the center of the yard, in the neutral ground by the well. He was carrying a bundle of something. He threw it at Silas Cray's feet. The bundle unrolled in the dust. It was a buckskin shirt, cheaply made and stiff. It was caked in dark, greasy patches and smeared with wet, dark red clay. The smell hit everyone at once, the sharp, chemical stink of axle grease, tar, and whiskey. The box canyon, Nalin gasped, pointing back the way he had come, where Yiska saw them. It is all there, the shirts, the paint pots, the wood, soaked in railroad oil. He pointed at the shirt. It is still sticky with the tar they use for the iron horse. Silas Cray's face went white. Before he could speak, Ruth Calder, who had been staring at the shirt with a look of dawning, horrific understanding, let out a low, animal sound. She jammed her hand into the pocket of her torn dress. "The spikes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The railroad spikes." She pulled out a crumpled, sweat-stained piece of paper. It was a receipt from the company store in Hollow Bend. "My PA," she said, her voice rising with every word. "He went to the store 2 days ago. He saw Silas. He saw him at the counter. He picked this up. Silas dropped it." She stumbled forward, shoving the paper into Beckett's hand. "Pa said it was strange. He said Silas was acting like a thief. Read it. Beckett, read it." Beckett's hands were shaking. He unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the lines. He looked up, his gaze finding Silas Cray. "It's a receipt," Beckett said, his voice quiet, but it carried across the dead-still yard. "For 20 pounds of new railroad spikes. But it's not from the mine." He held it up. "It's billed to a contractor, signed S. Cray, on behalf of the Great Meridian Railroad." The settlers murmured. Spikes, tar, railroads. "It still doesn't prove anything," Silas roared, his voice too loud, too desperate. "It's circumstantial. That's not a crime." "No," Beckett said, his voice suddenly cold as the well water. "It's not, but this is—" He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was not a receipt. It was a land purchase agreement, one the railroad had offered him 3 years ago, an offer he had refused. "This is the standard agreement," Beckett said, his voice booming, reading from the paper. "The one they offered me, the one they offered Jed Miller, the one they offered the Calders. Section 4. In the event of unavoidable delay or damage to property." He paused, his eyes finding Silas's again. He read the last 3 words of the clause, slowly, precisely, including hostile, conflict. He let the words hang. He looked at the settlers. "Do you understand our land is worthless to them as long as we're on it, but if it's damaged in a hostile conflict, the contract is void." Jed Miller finished, his voice a low, stunned whisper. The claim reverts. They can buy it for pennies. From the territory, not from us. They're not just stealing the land, Beckett said, his voice raw. They are creating the conflict. To do it, they need a war. The truth exploded in the center of the yard, as bright and as violent as the sun. Asha stepped forward. She looked at Tocho, who was still on the ridge, his face a mask of thunderous confusion. She spoke in her own language, her voice sharp and fast as an arrow. She did not translate. She accused. She pointed at the shirt, at the receipt, at Silas. He profits from the blood of the Calder family. He profits from the blood he wants you to spill. He is the fire. He is the lie. The change in Tocho was terrifying. The hot, red rage in his eyes did not vanish. It cooled. It condensed into a single, lethal point of blue-white fire. He had been tricked. He, a war chief, had been used as a pawn by a white man in a tin star. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his lance. This was the breaking point. Not for the warriors, but for the boy, Evan Dorr, who had been watching. His face pale, his rifle trembling, finally broke. A high, thin sound, half sob, half scream, tore from his throat. "He told us they hit first," Evan cried, the tears streaming down his face, cutting paths through the dust. He said the Calders were already dead. He said the Apache did it, that they were coming here next. He said it was a preemptive strike to save our families." He looked at the settlers, his fellow ranchers, his neighbors. "My ma, she's a widow. I just wanted to protect our claim. He said we were the law. He said we were heroes." It was over. The lie was exposed. The posse was broken. The motive was bare. Silas Cray was a dead man. He was ruined. And he knew it. His face contorted, all pretense of law or order dissolving into pure animal rage. This was all Beckett Rowan's fault. "You!" Silas snarled, his hand flashing to his hip, yanking his pistol from its holster, swinging it toward Beckett. He was fast, but he was not a professional. Kepler, the hired gun, was faster. He had no loyalty to Silas. He was paid to control chaos, and if that failed, to create it. He saw the entire parley collapse, saw his employer about to be lynched, and made the professional's choice start the massacre. Kepler's draw was a blur, his gun clearing leather a fraction of a second before Silas's, but he did not aim at Beckett. He aimed at Tocho on the ridge. A dead chief would guarantee the war Silas had paid for. No one was fast enough to stop him. Except Asha. She had not been watching Silas. She had not been watching Evan. From the moment the gunmen arrived, she had watched Brandis and Kepler. She knew where the real threat lay. As Kepler's arm snapped up, she moved. She did not lunge. She did not draw her rifle. She pivoted on her heel. A single, fluid motion. Her knife was in her hand, not as a blade, but as a club. Her arm blurred. There was a sharp, hard crack of bone on steel. She had brought the spine of her heavy knife down, not on Kepler's hand, but on the barrel of his rising pistol. The gun fired. The explosion tore the silence, deafeningly loud. The bullet, deflected, screamed harmlessly into the sky. A searing, angry whistle. For a full second, the world was frozen. Kepler, his hand stinging, his face a mask of pure shock. Silas, his own gun half drawn. Tocho, frozen on the ridge. The settlers, mouths open. Into that single stunned heartbeat, Beckett Rowan stepped. He threw his arms wide, planting himself directly in front of Asha, his body a shield, his chest bare, facing Kepler's smoking pistol and Silas's half-drawn one. "Go on," Beckett roared, his voice a raw thing of pure defiance. "Finish it. Shoot me. Shoot the man who read the receipt. Shoot the woman who found the proof. Shoot the evidence. In front of all of them. Do it." He was daring them. He was making himself the target. And in doing so, he was making them the murderers in front of 30 witnesses. It was the move that broke the spell. On the ridge, Tocho let out a short, sharp command. He did not charge. He and his warriors simply began to move, their ponies drifting down the slope, not in a rush, but as a silent, encircling tide, a net of bronze and iron closing around the posse. At the same time, Jed Miller, his face dark with rage, looked at his fellow settlers. "Block them!" The small, unarmed crowd of farmers surged forward. They did not attack. They formed a human wall, their pitchforks and shovels raised, a barrier of grim-faced farmers standing between the posse and any chance of escape. Silas Cray was trapped. He was surrounded by Apache to his north and settlers to his south. His own men were shattered, their guns lowered, their faces sick with the realization of what they had almost done. Kepler and Brandis looked at the odds. At the 30 rifles on the ridge, at the wall of angry farmers, they slowly, deliberately, raised their hands. Selar's hand was still frozen on his half-drawn gun. Ruth called her face streaked with tears but her back straight as an iron rod, stepped into the center of the yard. Her voice, no longer a victim's, was clear and cold, and full of a terrible new authority. "No," she shouted, her voice ringing. "We don't kill him here. We don't become him. We take him to Red Mesa. We take him to the federal court." She locked her eyes on Silas, her gaze full of a righteous, burning hate. "There's a law, Silas, a law bigger than your company, bigger than your star, and we." She jabbed a finger at the well, at the flat white stone. "We all have an oath. We have a promise to the water." Ruth's call for federal law in Red Mesa hung in the air, a new and startling idea. But the men Silas Cray had hired were not paid to go to court. They were paid to win, or to escape. Kepler, his hand stinging, his face a mask of fury, saw the net of warriors and settlers closing. He was not going to hang for this. He yanked his horse's head around, a brutal, sawing motion, and dug his spurs deep. The horse screamed and reared, lashing out with its front hooves, aiming for the gap between the settlers and the arroyo. It was a desperate, one-man stampede, but he was no longer facing a fractured crowd. "Nalin!" Asha's voice was a sharp command, not a shout. The young warrior had already anticipated the move. As Kepler's horse lunged, Nalin sprinted, not at the man, but at the horse's head. He was impossibly fast, a blur of buckskin. He launched himself, grabbing the bridle, his full weight pulling the horse's head down and to the side. At the same instant, Beckett, acting on pure rancher's instinct, moved to the other side. He didn't go for the man. He went for the reins, grabbing the leather straps near the bit, bracing his boots in the dust and pulling back with all the leverage his shoulders possessed. Kepler, his balance gone, his horse spinning in a tight, terrified circle, tried to bring his second pistol to bear, but Asha was there. She had moved to the third point of the triangle, and as the horse spun, she brought the heavy bone hilt of her knife up in a short, brutal arc, striking Kepler's forearm. A crack of bone, and the gun flew from his numb fingers. The pincer movement was complete, Nalin on the bridle, Beckett on the reins, Asha neutralizing the weapon. It was over in 3 seconds. The horse, panicked, reared one last time, and Kepler, trapped between the three of them, was wrenched from the saddle. He hit the ground with a sickening, solid thud. The wind knocked out of him. He lay gasping, his arm bent at an unnatural angle, but the professionals worked in pairs. While all eyes were on Kepler's dramatic capture, Brandis, the other gunman, saw his chance. He was not trying to escape. He was trying to create the massacre. He ripped his own Colt from its holster, but he did not aim at the warriors. He aimed at the center of the settlers. He aimed at Ruth. "No!" a voice screamed. It was Evan Dorr. He had been standing just feet from Ruth, his body trembling, his face a mask of shame. He saw the barrel of Brandis's gun swing. He did not have a plan. He was just a boy who had made a terrible mistake. He did the only thing he could. He lunged. He shoved Ruth hard, pushing her clear of the line of fire. The world exploded in a deafening crack. Evan grunted, a sound like a man being punched in the chest. He spun, his hand flying to his shoulder, a dark, wet stain instantly blossoming on his shirt. He staggered but did not fall. The shot, and Evan's sacrifice, broke the last of the posse's nerve. They raised their hands as one. Brandis, snarling, tried to cock his pistol for another shot, but he never had the chance. Beckett, his face a mask of cold fury, had seen Evan fall. He left Nolan to guard the winded Kepler and crossed the 10 feet in 3 long strides. He did not tackle Brandis from the horse. He grabbed the gunman's arm, the one holding the pistol, and used it as a lever, pulling Brandis out of the saddle. They crashed to the ground together in a tangle of limbs and dust. Brandis was a saloon fighter, but Beckett was a rancher, his strength born of hauling rope and wrestling steers. He wrenched Brandis's gun arm back until the pistol dropped. He twisted the man onto his stomach, pinning him with a knee in the back. "The rope!" Beckett snarled. Jed Miller, understanding, ripped the long, frayed hemp rope from the well's pulley and tossed it to him. Beckett's hands moved with an efficient, practiced violence. He did not tie a simple knot. He tied a double-cinch bovine knot, the kind used to bind the legs of a 1,000-pound bull. It was tight, complex, and utterly unbreakable. Brandis was trussed, immobilized in the dust, his curses muffled. In the sudden, shocked silence, Ruth rushed to Evan's side. "You're hurt. Oh, God, Evan!" The boy looked at his shoulder, his face pale but his eyes clear. "It's just a graze," he stammered, his teeth chattering. He was going to shoot you." He had, at last, protected someone. Now, all was still. Kepler was disarmed, his arm broken. Brandis was bound. The posse was in surrender, their hands in the air. The settlers were a grim-faced wall. The Apache were a silent, watchful net. Only one man remained. Silas Cray sat on his horse, his hand still frozen on the butt of his pistol, his face a pasty, grayish white. He was completely, hopelessly trapped. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, twisted in disgust. He looked at Tocho, whose expression was one of cold, lethal judgment. He finally tried to pull his gun, a last, spastic act of defiance. Before the pistol had even cleared the leather, Tocho was off his pony. The war chief moved with a speed that belied his size. He did not draw his own knife. He did not raise his lance. He simply grabbed Silas's wrist, his fingers a band of iron, and twisted. Silas screamed as his wrist bones ground together. The Colt dropped from his paralyzed fingers, landing softly in the dust by the well. The yard was utterly silent. The confrontation was over. Asha Tanaya walked forward. She ignored the groaning Kepler, the cursing Brandis, the weeping Evan. She walked past Silas, who was being held in Tocho's iron grip, and stood over the fallen pistol. She looked at it, this piece of metal that had caused so much death, the symbol of the law and the tool of the lie. She bent and picked it up. She did not aim it. She held it loosely in her hand. Then, with a flick of her thumb, she unlatched the loading gate. She turned the cylinder, and one by one, with her index finger, she ejected the brass cartridges. Click, thud. A bullet fell into the dust. Click, thud. Another. Click, thud. A third, until all 6 rounds were lying inert on the ground. She snapped the empty pistol shut. Then she turned, walked the 3 steps to the well, and placed the heavy, useless Colt on top of the flat, white, water-split stone. "The weapon lies still before the water," she said, her voice quiet, but it carried to every corner of the yard. A cold wind, the first of the day, swept through the clearing. It kicked up a spiral of dust. It found the crumpled land agreement that Beckett had dropped. It flipped the pages, one after another, the crisp sound loud in the silence. Flap, flap, flap. Silas's name, over and over, a dry, rhythmic confession. Beckett walked to his canteen, which was still looped over the well frame. He uncorked it, walked to where Tocho held Silas, and offered the water to the foreman. Silas, his face slick with sweat and fear, looked at the canteen with pure hatred. He spat in the dust. "I don't need your water," he croaked, his voice a raw whisper. I did what I had to. I was protecting civilization." Asha, standing by the stone, heard him. She looked at Silas, her eyes not filled with hate, but with a deep, profound pity. "Civilization," she said, her voice clear. begins when we offer the water. The moral judgment was complete. All that was left was the law. Tocho spoke. My warriors will take him. No, Jed Miller said, stepping forward, his pitchfork still in hand. He answers to us, to the families of Hollow Bend. We'll take him. A new argument threatened to erupt, but Ruth Calder, her voice hard, cut through it. We all take him. We all go to Red Mesa. We all tell the judge. It was decided. A mixed escort. Tocho nodded, a grim sign of respect. My warriors will ride guard to ensure he arrives. Jed Miller nodded back. And my farmers will walk with him to ensure he is not rescued by his company. I will write it down, Ruth said, her voice shaking but resolute. I will be the recorder. I will write every word I heard, every lie, every gunshot. Asha and I will lead. Beckett said. It was not a question. We will get you there. There was a scuffle, and Evan Dorr pushed his way forward, clutching a piece of torn cloth to his bleeding shoulder. His face was pale, but he stood tall, his head held high for the first time in his life. I'll go, he said, his voice trembling but firm. I'll go, too. I was part of it. I will testify. I will tell them what Mr. Cray made us do. I will tell them the truth. Beckett looked at the boy, at the farmers, at the warriors. He looked at Asha. The prisoners, Silas, Brandis, and Kepler, were bound and hauled to their feet. They would walk. The procession formed. A strange, impossible column. Tocho's warriors, their faces grim, flanked the prisoners, the settlers, their farm tools now symbols of a new authority, walked behind them. Ruth, Evan, Beckett, and Asha took their place at the front. They began the long march south toward Red Mesa, away from the well, away from the cabins, away from the killing ground. They were a bizarre, hybrid body, a collection of people who had been, only that morning, mortal enemies. Now, they moved as one, their boots and moccasins kicking up a single, shared cloud of dust, walking in step toward a law they had all just agreed to build. The march to Red Mesa was a 2-day ordeal, a walking trial before the one that waited. The strange procession of 30-odd people moved south, a cloud of alkali dust in their wake. They were a bizarre, temporary nation, born of a single, violent morning. Tocho's warriors, rifles ready, rode the flanks, their faces impassive. They were not guards for the settlers, nor were they allies. They were escorts for the truth, ensuring the men who had mocked their traditions and used them as pawns would face the white man's justice. The settlers, led by Jed Miller and the Cartwrights, walked in a grim, determined cluster, their pitchforks and axes now serving as the insignia of a people's posse. In the center, bound and walking, were the prisoners. Silas Cray, his face a mask of sunburned, silent fury. Brandis, his hands tied behind him, his eyes dead. Kepler, his broken arm in a crude sling, his every step a jolt of pain. At the front, Beckett and Asha walked side by side. They were the unspoken leaders of this mobile court. Behind them, Ruth Calder walked with Evan Dorr. His shoulder was tightly bandaged with a strip of her own petticoat. They were a pair of ghosts, children who had seen the mechanics of the world and been aged by it. On the evening of the second day, they reached Whisper Wash. It was not a wash, but a wide, dry riverbed, a sandy scar carved through the flats, lined with skeletal cottonwoods and palo verde. The sun was a smear of apricot and lavender. Red Mesa was still half a day's march away. We stop, Tocho commanded, his voice raw with dust. The camp was made with the weary efficiency of survivors. A central fire was built. The settlers shared their hardtack and jerky with the warriors, a gesture of practicality, not friendship. The prisoners were tied to a wagon wheel brought by one of the farmers and given water and a piece of bread, then ignored. The sun died, and the night bloomed, vast and cold. The sky was an explosion of stars, so clear and bright they seemed to drip. A meteor shower, which had been active for a week, intensified. Stars fell like silent, silver rain streaking across the black. Ruth sat by the fire, her small ledger on her knee, a piece of charcoal in her hand, writing with a grim focus. Evan sat near her, nursing his arm, watching the flames. The camp was a quiet hum of exhaustion. Beckett stood apart, watching the prisoners. He felt 1,000 miles from his own life. Asha finished checking on her men. Koho was strong enough to walk. Nalan and Taryn were sitting with Yiska, sharing a quiet smoke. She saw Beckett, a solitary figure staring at the man who had murdered his wife. She walked toward him. He heard her, the soft scuff of her moccasins in the sand. He didn't turn. "They won't get away," she said, her voice quiet. "I know," Beckett replied. "I'm not worried about that. I'm trying to see the man who did it. All I see is a greedy, scared foreman." "He is small," Asha agreed. "The shadow he casts is the only thing that was large." They stood in silence, the murmur of the camp behind them. "Let's walk," Beckett said. A sudden need to move, to get away from the sight of his enemy. She nodded. They moved away from the firelight, following the curve of the dry riverbed. The sand was cool and soft under their boots, muffling their footsteps. The only sound was the wind, a low whisper in the dry cottonwood leaves. The starlight was so bright it cast pale, sharp shadows. "Tomorrow," Beckett said. "In the courthouse. What do you think happens?" "We speak," Asha said simply. "Ruth speaks. Evan speaks. Yiska and Nalan will show the shirts. We will place the stone on the judge's table." "You'd bring the stone." "It is the witness," she said. "The water heard the truth at your well. The stone will carry that truth to Red Mesa." They walked on, their shoulders almost touching. The shared trauma of the last 2 days, the intimacy of the barn, the violence of the capture. It had forged a bond that neither of them had words for. "When it's over," Beckett said, his voice rough. "Silas will hang. The company will deny him. They'll send another man." "Yes," Asha said. "They will always send another man." "So what did we win?" he asked, stopping. He looked at her, his face carved in silver and shadow by the starlight. "We caught the killers, but the war, the one for the land, for the water, that's not over." "No," she said. She stopped, turning to face him. "But it has changed. Before, we fought each other. Now, we know where to look." They stood close, the air between them charged. The night was vast. The sky was falling in silent, beautiful fire, and they were the only 2 people in the world. Asha looked at his face, at the lines of grief and exhaustion that were, for the first time, softened by a different kind of light, a resolve. He was no longer the hollowed-out man she had met by the well. Slowly, she raised her good hand. It was not a gesture of passion, but of fact. She placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel the steady, solid thump-thump of his life, a rhythm that was strong and sure beneath his flannel shirt. It was the most real thing she had felt in months. Beckett's breath caught in his throat. He looked down at her hand, dark against his shirt, then up to her face. Her eyes were unguarded, the warrior's vigilance replaced by a woman's profound, quiet curiosity. His own hand, the one that had tied the knot on Brandis, the one that had hauled the rope, came up. He moved with a tenderness that felt foreign to him. His rough, calloused fingers were infinitely gentle as he touched her cheek. He brushed a single, errant strand of black hair from her temple, his thumb grazing her skin. "Asha," he whispered. It was the first time he had said her name with no one else to hear. He leaned in. She met him. The second kiss was nothing like the first. The first, in the barn, had been a spark in the dark, a question born of shared survival. This was the answer. It was slow. It was deep. It was a deliberate, conscious claiming. His mouth was warm, tasting of dust and the faint, bitter coffee from the fire. It was a kiss of profound, aching relief, a promise given and received. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her steady. His other arm came around her waist, pulling her flush against him, careful of her healing shoulder, holding her as if she were the only anchor in the spinning starlit world. Her hand, which had been flat on his chest, fisted, her fingers gripping his shirt, pulling him closer. Her other arm, the wounded one, came up to rest on his shoulder. It was a complete, mutual surrender. They stood in the dry riverbed, locked in an embrace that sealed the truth they had both sworn on the stone. When they finally broke for air, they did not move apart. They rested their foreheads together, breathing the same breath, their hearts pounding in a shared, frantic rhythm. Asha murmured something, her voice a low vibration against his skin. The words were in her own language, soft and flowing, like the water that was missing from the riverbed. Beckett did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He just held her, his eyes closed, his face buried in her hair. She pulled back, just enough to look at him. Her eyes were bright, the falling stars reflected in their dark depths. "It means," she whispered, her voice husky, "my heart chooses courage." Beckett felt a crack in his chest, the final wall of his grief, the one he had held onto for May, crumbling to dust. He was not betraying his past. He was choosing to have a future. He held her tighter, a surge of fierce, protective warmth flooding him. "If we have a future," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick. "If this peace, if we can make it hold, I'll do more than just share the well." He pulled back, his hands on her shoulders, his gaze locked on hers. "I will build a trough, a long one, of new pine. I will run it from my well, past the fence line, to the edge of the trail. A shared trough, Asha, for my cattle, and for your ponies. Water for anyone who passes. No one," he said, his voice raw. "No one will ever thirst at my border again." A slow, radiant smile spread across her face. It transformed her, washing away the warrior, leaving only the woman. "That's a good promise. Beckett Rowan," she said. "And when you build this trough, we will take the stone, the water split stone from your well." She reached out, taking his hand. "We will place it in the middle," she said, her fingers lacing with his, "right between our two sides. A place where everyone who drinks can put their hand, a place to remember the truth." He looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and pale, hers strong and dark. They did not kiss again. They did not need to. They turned, still holding hands, and began the slow walk back to the fire. They moved in silence, a quiet, unshakable determination radiating between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the future they had just agreed to build. From the camp, Ruth Calder watched them approach, two figures, one shadow, emerging from the darkness. She looked down at her ledger, at the small, angry charcoal strokes. She dipped the charcoal in the ash, and on a new page, she wrote the date, September 9th, 1872. She whispered to herself. Then she added the line, her own oath, her own truth. "The day we chose water over blood." The federal courthouse in Red Mesa was a different kind of desert. It was a box of dry, echoing air, smelling of old paper, stale tobacco, and the faint, sharp tang of ammonia used to clean the floors. It was built of brick, a dark red wound in the bright landscape, and it represented an authority that, until now, had been mostly theoretical. The judge, a man named Harlan, had been sent from the east. He was tired, his black robes were dusty, and he had seen too much. He looked at the procession that had entered his court with a kind of weary resignation, a collection of armed Apache warriors, a group of dirt farmers carrying pitchforks, and a trussed-up mine foreman who was bleeding from the wrist where Tocho had gripped him. But the evidence, laid out on the long oak table at the front of the court, was not theoretical. It was brutally real. There was the cheap, tar-stiffened buckskin shirt. There was the clay pot, still streaked with dark red paint. There was the receipt from the Hollow Bend store, signed by S. Cray, for 20 pounds of railroad spikes. And there was the Great Meridian Railroad land contract, with its small, lethal clause about hostile conflict. The jury was made of men like Beckett, ranchers from the outer territories, shopkeepers from Red Mesa, a blacksmith, a freight agent. They were men who understood land and who understood greed. Ruth Calder spoke first. Her voice, thin and reedy in the open air, became a pillar of iron in the quiet courtroom. She told them about her father. She told them about the stolen water. She told them about the men who came at dawn, whooping like savages, and how she had hidden in the root cellar, listening to her father die. Then, Evan Dorr spoke. He stood with his arm in a sling, his good hand gripping the railing of the witness box so hard his knuckles were white. He did not cry this time. His voice was flat, dead, and utterly convincing. He told the court and the jury that Silas Cray had lied to them. He said Silas had told them the Calders were already dead, that they were riding to intercept a war party. He repeated the words Brandis had told him, "You get paid to shoot, not to think." Nayland and Yiska gave their testimony through a translator, a bored-looking half-Apache man provided by the court. They described the box canyon. They described the painted men washing in the creek. They described the crate, stamped with the railroad's name. The defense was nothing. Silas Cray, his face purple, his voice a hoarse shout, claimed it was a conspiracy, that the ranchers were jealous of the mine's success, that the natives were lying savages. It took the jury 10 minutes. Silas Cray was found guilty, not of murder, the disguise made that impossible to prove, but of conspiracy to commit organized violence, and 11 counts of federal land fraud. Brandis and Kepler, the hired guns, were found guilty as accessories. The judge, his face grim, sentenced them to 20 years of hard labor at the federal prison in Yuma. Justice was done. It was a quiet, heavy thing. The walk back to Mesquite Flats was different. The settlers and the warriors did not walk as a single, tense body. They parted ways at the edge of town, the settlers heading south, Tocho and his warriors heading north. But before they left, Tocho and Jed Miller stood in the dusty street outside the courthouse. They did not shake hands, but they signed their names. Tocho with an X, Miller with a cramped signature, to a document Ruth Calder had written out on a piece of clean paper. It was called the Common Water Agreement. It was a simple contract. It stated that the well at the Rowan Ranch was a neutral site. It stated that the families of Hollow Bend and the people of Tocho's band would respect its boundaries. And it stated that the smoke signal 3 long, 2 short, 1 long no longer meant a call to a war parley. Its meaning was changed. Forever. It now meant come and drink, come and talk. The land breathed. A month passed. The first chill of autumn began to blunt the terrible heat of the day. The sound of hammering returned to Beckett's ranch. He had bought new pine boards in Hollow Bend, trading his father's old saddle for them. He worked for a week, sawing and measuring, sealing the wood with pine tar. He built the trough he had promised Asha. It was long, clean, and sturdy. It began at his well, and it extended 30 feet, passing directly under the bottom rung of his Ocotillo fence, ending in a wide, welcoming pool of wood on the other side. On the day he finished, Asha arrived. She was not alone. Coho, Nalin, Taran, and Yiska rode with her, but they did not come as warriors. They brought horses to trade. She was carrying something heavy in a sling. As Beckett filled the new trough for the first time, the clear, sweet water rushing from the bucket, gurgling as it filled the pine basin, Asha knelt at its base. She unwrapped the sling and carefully, with both hands, placed the flat, white, water-split stone on the ground, precisely where the trough crossed the boundary of the fence. It was the new cornerstone of the territory. The story began to spread, carried by freighters and Apache hunters, of the rancher who had built a trough for his enemies, and the stone that demanded the truth from any man who came to drink. The legend of the water-split stone. Life settled into a new rhythm. Coho, fully recovered, now joked that Beckett's water was stronger than whiskey. Nalin, who had become a frequent visitor, sat on the fence, watching Beckett restring his frayed well rope. "You work hard, rancher," Nayland teased, his English improving. But your heart, it works harder. How much water can a white man's heart hold? Anyway, enough for a whole tribe. Beckett flushed, fumbling the rope. Asha, who was inspecting a horse with Jed Miller, looked over, her face stern, and shot Nayland a warning look. Nayland's smile faltered. Then, Asha's serious expression cracked, and she laughed. It was not a giggle. It was a low, warm, genuine laugh. A sound Beckett had never heard. It was the sound of summer. The trading began. The settlers, their fear gone, brought salt, dried beans, and metal tools. Tocho's people, wary but curious, brought cured herbs, strong ponies, and woven blankets. A small, weekly market established itself by the trough, and the children came. The Miller boys, Ruth's younger siblings, and the Apache children. Shy at first, began to meet at the trough. Their parents, busy with trade. Let them be. Soon, they were playing a game of tag, their high, clear laughter mixing their small feet in boots and moccasins, kicking up the same dust. There were no weapons. There was no fear. Just the sound of running and the shouting of a game. Beckett took his knife. He went to the stone lip of the well, the place where he had hauled the rope for so many years in bitter silence. He began to carve, the letters deep and sure. First, in English, water is for the thirsty. And then, just below it, Asha guided his hand, showing him the symbols of her own language, and he carved the same sentiment. When he was done, Asha placed her hand in a patch of wet clay he had mixed from the well's overflow. She pressed her palm and fingers flat. He pressed his own hand beside it. 2 hands, 2 languages, 1 truth. They were finishing when the sky changed. The wind, which had been blowing hot and dry from the south, shifted. It came from the north, and it carried the smell Asha had named the promise, the sharp, electric tang of ozone and wet creosote. A single, fat drop of water hit the dust at their feet. Then another, then a dozen. The first rain of the season began to fall, a steady, gray, life-giving curtain that swept across the flats. It was not a violent storm, but a soaking, healing rain. Asha, who had spent her life fighting the sun, tilted her head back. She closed her eyes, letting the cool water run down her face, washing away the last of the dust. A small, secret smile on her lips. Beckett watched her, his heart aching with a feeling so full it almost hurt. He took off his own worn canvas jacket, the one that smelled of hay and wood smoke, and gently, carefully, pulled it around her shoulders. She opened her eyes and looked at him. She did not thank him. She just leaned into the warmth, pulling the collar closer, and he put his arm around her. They stood together by the well, their handprints already setting in the clay, and watched the rain fall on their land. The legend of that day is still told. They say that when the first rains finally came, they washed the blood from the sand and the hate from the hearts of the people. They say the frontier of the San Cristobal territory shifted that year. It was not a line on a map. It was a line drawn in the dust by a grieving rancher, a line that was crossed the moment a poor man, with nothing left to lose, offered his last drop of water to his mortal enemy. The war, of course, was not over. The railroad was a snake, and they had only cut off its rattle. A month later, a rumor came down the wire to Red Mesa. Silas Cray, in the Yuma prison, had been talking, desperate to save himself. He spoke of a bigger man, a man who paid for the guns and the tar, a major stockholder in the Great Meridian Railroad, a man who never left his office in the new, rich, booming town of Copper Vale, a new shadow, waiting in the wings. And then the letter came. It arrived with the weekly freight. It was on thick, expensive paper, mailed from back east. It bore the wax seal of a law firm in Boston. It was addressed to Beckett Rowan. It was an offer, a generous one, from an anonymous investor, to buy his small, dusty, seemingly worthless patch of land. The letter was very specific. The offer was contingent on acquiring the land, the well, and, as the final line read, the flat limestone marker of local significance located upon the property. Becky. The user's input cuts off again. Assuming Beckett was intended, Beckett stood by the trough, the letter in his hand. Asha, who had been watering her pony, walked over to read it with him. She finished, and a slow, familiar smile spread across her face. It was not the soft smile of the rain. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at her. He smiled back. It was a smile that was all fight. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I am so curious to know where in the world you are tuning in from. Please let me know in the comments below, and share your thoughts on Beckett and Asha's journey. It is always a pleasure to connect with you. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and if you truly want to support this channel, please hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.